BBC Sounds. Music, radio, podcasts.
This podcast contains adult themes, very strong language, and language that may offend. It's dawn on the 1st of March 1972. Michael is lying on a makeshift bed of wooden poles and sacking, which have been prepared for him by an old man called Mr. Bishop. He's a solitary coal burner living in the Guyanese jungle in a little shack, and he's lying in his bed too, scared of his guest. Bishop knows Michael is wanted by the police, as Michael freely admitted as much when he arrived last night. Mr. Bishop gave him some mustard stew and a place to stay to keep him on side. But Michael, who's fast asleep, has no idea that the police are hot on his trail. They have surrounded Mr. Bishop's camp, and they are now creeping towards the shelter. Michael has been on the run for 10 days. 2 bodies have been found buried in the ground at his home in Christina Gardens in Trinidad. He's an international fugitive. The Trinidadian and Guyanese police and Interpol are all after him. My name is Hamza Salmi, and this is the final episode of Who Was Michael X? Episode 8, Requiem for an Illusion.
All he had with him was a haversack with a few tins of sardines and some bread, cheese and biscuits, a fishing line and hooks. He had no gun but a short knife. With this meagre equipment he set off down the Rockstone Trail, a narrow sandy track that winds its way through the jungle 90 miles to the Essequibo.
Michael's audacious plan was to escape by crossing the Essequibo River into Brazil, where he knew he could avoid extradition. But he was woefully ill-prepared.
It was raining now. Already his clothes were bedraggled, his shoes were split. He was extremely tired. Then, suddenly, he heard the sound of voices coming from the side of the trail. He'd stumbled, by chance, on a party of surveyors.
Did he look frightened when he arrived here?
No, he looked a rather brave fellow, he come in. He didn't look frightened, but he was looking suspicious.
But to say he wanted to go to Brazil, which is over 200 miles through the
far
jungle,
yes.
Do you think he would have made it?
No, he could have made it and could not have made it.
But what
if
about...
he get assistance, he would have made it.
Michael was recognized by the surveyors, but they didn't let on. Instead, they directed him to the charcoal burner, Mr. Bishop's shack, while one of them went to alert the police.
Before he settled down to sleep, Malik told Mr. Bishop that he'd been let down by black people and that he wanted to start a new life with the Amerindians, people he could trust. But as Mr. Bishop stayed awake watching him, the police were already closing in on the hut. At dawn, 3 of them crept up to where Malik was sleeping. They put a revolver to his head, prodded him, and Malik's first words were, "Please don't shoot, there's no need for that."
BBC reporter David Tyndall was hot on Michael's trail too, covering the story for Newsnight.
Mr. Bishop, as he's called, rarely has visitors at the best of times.
What did he say to you when he first met you?
When he first met me, he told me that thousands of police is after him and he's Malik. And he's hungry. I get up and prepare some tea for him.
When I spoke to
Make
David
tea
Tyndall
for him.
recently, he vividly remembered how shocked Mr. Bishop was.
When I interviewed him, just after Michael had been arrested, he was smoking a cigarette, Victor Bishop, this old coal burner. And while he's talking to me, he's still terrified of what might happen. He didn't have this attention ever in his life, criminals suddenly on his doorstep, these guys from television and the police, and he was smoking a cigarette. And all the time it was going down and down and down, hanging from his lip. And even when it had finished and was burning his lip, he didn't move it.
And Mr. Bishop was right to be frightened. He'd heard on the radio that Michael X was a wanted man. The media was swarming around Christina Gardens and watching gruesome evidence being unearthed.
Men of the Trinidad and Tobago Regiment are carrying out a search of the whole area, now using mine detectors. I asked the colonel of the regiment why they decided to go to the lengths of using this sort of equipment.
Well, we are searching from north to south, east to west of the entire area. We are going by square inch to square inch. And we have been at this for several days already. And we intend to continue until we have completed the whole area.
And there were lots of rumours circulating. An anonymous tip-off at a local paper stated that Joe Skerritt's murder had just been an accident. He'd been beaten up to teach him a lesson, but it had gone too far. But there was also a deep-seated fear by Trinidadian residents that Michael wasn't just a killer, but actually had some kind of spiritual power. If you remember, his mother Iona was known on the island for having a thriving Obeah business. Obeah is a spiritual practice. Using magic, it's thought that you could bring fortune or misfortune to yourself and others. According to other members of the commune, Michael had recently carried out an Obeah ceremony, sacrificing a calf and drinking its blood. And there were suspicions that there might have been other murders.
Police believe that another body may be hidden in the grounds here and that a quantity of arms and ammunition may also be hidden in the area. One man, a British subject, who is known to have visited his house sometime just before the two murders were discovered, is not on record as yet as having left the country.
Even to this day, a man called Michael Duchesne, who was said to have hung out at Christina Gardens, has never been found. Once captured from Mr. Bishop's hut, Michael was transported back to Trinidad, where a ludicrous number of police were waiting.
Michael de Freitas, Michael X or Abdul Malik, to use the name he goes by in the Caribbean, arrived from Guyana on a scheduled flight, but the security arrangements left no one in doubt about the amount of official concern there is over his activities on the island. And the public interest caused by his capture highlights the sort of sensation the double murder mystery is causing here. No one was allowed near as Malik himself came out of the plane, looking drawn, almost frail, doubtless caused in part by his attempt to get to Brazil through virtually impassable country. Just to make sure of his safe delivery to prison in Port of Spain, the police escort drove out of the back of the airport.
Rafiq Shah, who'd been imprisoned for being a leader in the attempted coup, which had put Trinidad and Tobago into a state of emergency, had to move jail cells to make room for Michael. He remembers the fear authorities had of Michael and his people.
They were instructed by the authorities that once Michael and his people came into prison, they were never to look Michael X in the eyes because he was supposed to possess some uncanny qualities that he could hypnotize people if you looked at him in his eyes. And furthermore, they were to stay very clear of his cell and only have, like when they went to take food for him or something like that, put the food. And the prisons officers themselves, they were very afraid of this man because they felt he had supernatural powers, and the authorities here as well. And I didn't understand why people were afraid of this man. I couldn't figure it out at all.
By this time, several members of the commune at Christina Gardens were in custody under the same roof. Edward Chady, the car salesman, Palmer Sarr, the farmhand, and Stanley Abbott, Michael's once loyal follower. Edward Chady remembers Abbott trying to influence his story.
Abbott came to me with a sheet of paper. He was making the questions and answers for me. That indoctrination, that criminal attitude he had, trying to use this on me, that I should say what he wants.
Michael was charged with the double murder of Gaylan Benson and Joe Skerritt. The Attorney General of Trinidad, Carl Hudson Phillips, in a highly unusual move, took on the case personally. Finding no one on the island prepared to defend him, Michael looked further afield. A barrister had telegrammed him from the neighbouring island of St. Lucia, saying, "The best lawyer in the Caribbean is prepared to defend you. I have never lost a murder trial." This was technically true, as Kenneth Foster had never worked on a murder trial before. David Tyndall covered it for the BBC, even managing a broadcast first, filming in a Crown Court.
The atmosphere outside the court was just like carnival. Hundreds of people in the street vendors selling all kinds of things. and all manner of people come to town. They love a good story, so you can hear all kinds of tales being spread that morning about this, that, and the other, you know. They killed this woman, this lady who was a spy, you know, and working for MI6 or something like that. And also, they had these wonderful tall policemen, 6 feet, pin smart, looking fantastic, with their white helmets all around the court, inside the court as well. Yet some chickens had got into the court. And there was one Obeah woman, you know, old lady with a little sieve with some stones and bones in the sieve. And she was shaking and going, shh, the Obeah man arrived when Michael X is brought in.
At the first hearing, Michael appeared confident. Dressed in an outfit from Carnaby Street, he raised his fist in a Black Power salute as he entered the courtroom, reverting to his usual self-promotional style. On the face of it, Michael had some reason to be optimistic. The only evidence the prosecution had against him were the words of the other commune members, who were accomplices to the murders. It was in their interest to point the finger at him.
He was quite convinced that he would get off, that he would be freed of any charge, that his friends in London would be able to mount some legal defense for him and he wouldn't be executed. For a long time he believed that. Probably 3 or 4 times in the week, when he was in the Port of Spain jail, I get a call from one of the warders saying he wants to have a word with you. And I'd go and leave the hotel and go and visit him. He'd spooked some of the warders into believing that he had some Obeah powers. Obeah is a local form of voodoo or witchcraft. He didn't have any of these powers, but he would give people the impression that he did have these occult powers. And in that society, people are quite frightened of that sort of thing. And then sometimes he would just be reciting some of his poetry, the survival of blacks in white society. Not very good poetry. And he would be off on a trip, you know. The warders in the Port of Spain jail gave him marijuana whenever he wanted it, so he had a smoke, because he wasn't convicted at that time.
Even in the jail cell, Michael was still trying to project an image of a man with power. He contacted fellow prisoner Rafiq Shah.
He sent a note scribbled on a little piece of paper addressed to Brother Shah, and it was signed Brother Michael X. He wanted to talk with me. He had so much that he wanted to tell me. I simply ignored it, but he never let up. He kept sending notes one after the other. He wanted to meet, he wanted to talk with me. And I remember very well one of the notes came on a piece of cloth. And this man had the audacity to offer me a position. Brother Shah, you'll be out soon, and I would like you to link up with the BLA. I wondered what the hell was the BLA. Turns out it was the Black Liberation Army, which I figured was a figment of Michael X's imagination. And he was offering me the grand title of Colonel in the Black Liberation Army. So I just ignored the note again, put it aside, and we all had a good laugh at it.
Michael found support from his famous friends, especially Lennon, who paid his defense costs. The Trinidadian nation was captivated by the trial. The legendary calypso singer Lord Kitchener even wrote hit songs about it. One was titled Stanley Abbott, the other, One to Hang. As economist and writer Lloyd Best explains, the Trinidadian people recognized Michael as one of their own.
Double celebrity now, a real one, because this now had nothing to do with politics and so on. This brought in the whole country. Murder is a big thing, and of course, the way in which he did it too. I mean, this was not a crime de passion or anything like that. This was really a major operation in which he buried them darkly at the death of night. So the whole country was glued to him thereafter. When he made the dash for Guyana, I mean, that was the thing of cinema. He really became a celebrity, and ever since then people have known him. Everybody now knows him. That made him a completely different thing from what he was before. Not as a fringe man in politics, which is of interest only to some people, political people, but really as a central figure in the whole Trinidad civilization, which is a particular kind of smart man civilization. People really understood him. Yeah? The country really understood him. Smart man doesn't mean that he's intelligent. It means that he is given to ruses. A smart man means a schemer. And he was the quintessential schemer.
But then the state decided they would try the murders separately, beginning with Joe Skerritt, as it was the strongest case against Michael. 17 days before the trial was to start, Adolphus Parmesar, the yard boy, cut a deal with the prosecution, turning Queen's evidence. He was acquitted of the murders and free to go, in return for testifying as the prosecution's star witness.
The Crown says this body is that of the very Joseph Skerritt, and that on that day, unwittingly, Joseph Skerritt was digging his own grave.
Kenneth Foster, Michael's lawyer, didn't give Michael the best defense. Firstly, he allowed Parmesar to give evidence without calling into question his reliability as a witness. Then, he failed to expose flaws in his and Abbott's stories. They had testified that Joe Skerritt's head had nearly been decapitated, and yet he was able to stumble around yelling, "I go tell, I go tell." But how could he have done so with such a fatal injury? They also claimed he'd been finished off with a final blow to the head. But why did the coroner's report make no mention of a head injury? But possibly Foster's worst decision was to instruct Michael not to take the witness stand. This was because he was worried that Michael's criminal history would be admissible in court and unduly influence the jury. Here he is speaking in the year 2000.
The trial as it went was obviously a fair trial, but this one hurdle we haven't got over yet. It's the hurdle of adverse publicity in a small country or small population where people know each other, they know each other's fathers, sisters, brothers, and cousins. And when you have that type of publicity, all that was said against Malik in England, what he had done and the different allegations, he really had a very poor chance of surviving. I'm not too sure if I really argued the Craig case, but he really stood a chance of a snowball in hell, really.
Considering everyone was familiar with Michael's past, this wouldn't have made much difference. Instead, it meant that Michael was unable to tell his own version of events or contradict the testimonies of Parmesar and Abbott. Michael ended up giving an unsworn statement, which he read out in court, but the judge told the jury they could not take it into account. In any event, it was said to be a rambling speech in which he asked, "Why should I turn to crime?" He said, "I came to Trinidad to build a home for myself, wife and family, my children." His most salient arguments were that he had no knowledge of the murder of Skerritt, hadn't planned it, and had been elsewhere when it took place. He said it was nonsense that he would murder Skerritt, his little cousin, that he'd known since he was a baby. He said that the accusations were part of a conspiracy to frame him, and also questioned why the Attorney General was prosecuting his case, as he was a politician. Stanley Abbott, on the other hand, did take the stand and witheringly attacked his former leader and friend. He described Michael as a Jekyll and Hyde character who'd instilled deep fear in his followers, who were merely pawns. He said Michael had used the divide and conquer principle to create an aura of fear at the commune. He described Skerritt's murder as just one part of Michael's campaign of terror and extortion, which he was preparing to launch on the Trinidadian government. Michael's defense lawyer, Kenneth Foster, told the jury that Abbott and Parmesar were telling a pack of lies and weaving a fantastic fairy tale. Why would Michael organize an attack on a police station when the country was in a state of emergency and security incredibly tight? Foster suggested that there was foul play and that Abbott and Parmesar's testimonies were a politically motivated conspiracy that the police had helped to concoct. The accusation of political conspiracy by Foster may have foundation. When I went to the National Archives at Kew to look at Foreign Office files on Michael X, I discovered a message from the High Commissioner to Trinidad, Mr. Hunt, which he'd sent to London on the 26th of February 1972, before Michael had even been arrested, reporting on a conversation he'd had with Dr. Williams, the Prime Minister of Trinidad. saying Trinidad could now be relied upon to make a good job on Mr. Malik. The trial lasted 25 days, and on Monday the 21st of August 1972, the jury took only an hour to return their verdict. Michael was guilty of murder and Stanley Abbott of manslaughter. The Attorney General, Carl Hudson Phillips, described what then happened.
The judge would rise after the verdict and change from his scarlet robes to black robes, and he would take off his wig and put on a black cap and return to court. 2 police officers would stand on either side of him in full uniform, which would be the white and the helmet with the chain strap. The court would be ordered to stand, and the judge would remain sitting and pronounce the sentence of death, sign the warrant, and then break the pen, and he would say, "Take the prisoners away."
Michael was taken to death row. With a murder conviction now secured, the charge against him in the Gail Benson murder was kept in reserve, in case he successfully appealed his conviction. However, a year later, without Michael on the dock, it was Edward Chadey and Stanley Abbott that stood trial for her murder, even though Chadey had always claimed that he'd been an involuntary witness. Here is Chadey in 2012 describing the moment the verdict was read out in court on the 16th of July, 1973.
Abbott, number 1 accused. How do you find number 1 accused? Guilty or not guilty? The former jury said guilty as charged. Well, Abbott jumped up on the bench in the court and started a prance. How we spoke the truth and look what they do. However, they say number 2 accused. How do you find number 2 accused? They say guilty as charged. After that, the judge is going to pass sentence now. So, do you have anything to say before sentence is passed? Abbott gone again. The police had to hold him down because he's jumping up on the bench. When they come to me now, they ask me if I have anything to say before sentence is passed. I look in front of me and I see all these lawyers just in front of me. And everybody just looked back at me. So I said I had nothing to say. And that was it. Sentence passed, they'll be hung by your neck until death. Take them away.
Abbott was kept on death row and hung in 1979. The reason we are able to hear from Chadey is that his death sentence was commuted to life and he was finally given a presidential pardon and released from jail in 1987. I find Gail's murder trial baffling. It has so many loose ends. Firstly, Gail's lover, Hakeem Jamal, was interviewed by a Trinidadian superintendent in Boston, but was never called on to give evidence or face trial. When we consider that 82% of women are killed by their partner or ex-partner, according to UN figures, how could the investigation ignore Hakeem's involvement? This is a man who was mentally unstable, calling himself God, previously convicted of attempted murder. In addition, we know that the neighbors overheard Hakeem and Gail fighting on the night of her murder, and that a fingernail was found lodged behind her tongue. Herbert Girardet, the former business partner of Gail and Hakeem, if you remember, was threatened by them and feared for his life, told police in the strictest confidence following her death that Hakeem had unusually long fingernails. Secondly, Hakeem's friend, Kidogo, who was identified by key witnesses as the person who made the first fatal swipes at Gail's body, was never extradited back to Trinidad to be questioned, let alone face trial. But let me tell you one thing which makes the omission of Kidogo even more perplexing. Hakeem Jamal is murdered on the 1st of May 1973, 2 months before Gail Benson's trial. Who was present at his murder? Kidogo. The events surrounding Hakeem's murder and Kidogo's part in it are suspicious in themselves, but we'll have to leave that for another time. Suffice to say, Kidogo may not have been all that he seemed. Hakeem Jamal was a high-priority target on the FBI's counterintelligence program due to his Black Power activities. One of their well-known strategies was to install double agents and informants in social movements in the US. Kidogo was never found culpable for either Gail or Hakeem's murder. Could it be that he was an FBI agent? Could Gail's murder have been an attempt to bring down the commune and with it, Hakim and Michael. And then there's the question of Gail being a possible agent. Remember, she was accused by Diana Athill of stealing money and was caught several times in Michael's room going through his personal papers. The film The Bank Job portrays her as an MI5 agent trying to recover the alleged photographs of Princess Margaret, but at her murder trial, that was never mentioned. Instead, she was rumoured to be involved with the CIA, as reported by David Tyndall for Newsnight.
On the evening of January the 1st, Malik called his men together here behind the house and told them he wanted Gail disposed of. He told them an unlikely story that she was an agent for the CIA, hired to spy on the Black Power movement, and that she'd found out too much.
I find the idea of Gail being any kind of agent unlikely. However, an increasingly paranoid Michael could have. There is no satisfactory resolution to these different threads. But I can't help thinking that if Gail's death was premeditated, and we are to believe the prosecution's case, then it was an incredibly risky thing for Michael to do. He knew the authorities were watching him and waiting to catch him out. Gail and Hakim were also booked on flights out of Trinidad later in January. Gail's back to the UK, Hakim to the US. Why not just let her go? Back on death row, Michael had launched a series of appeals, financed by the new International Committee to Save Michael X, which included people like John Lennon, Yoko Ono, American journalist Gloria Steinem, singer Leonard Cohen, comedian Dick Gregory, and folk singer Judy Collins, who even sent a personal letter to the Prime Minister of England demanding a stay of execution. They claimed that Michael was a political prisoner and that capital punishment was no way to deal with him. The famous American lawyer William Kunstler, who had defended civil rights activists like Martin Luther King, Stokely Carmichael, and Angela Davis, took up the political prisoner angle, claiming Michael was innocent and that he could prove it. But he fell at the first hurdle, by failing to realize it was impossible for him to represent Michael in a Trinidadian court, which fell under the UK legal system. He was trained for the US. Geoffrey Robertson, now King's Counsel and with a formidable reputation as a human rights lawyer, was then a newly qualified barrister. He paid his own fare, using his overdraft, to visit Michael on death row.
The experience of actually being on death row, to see Michael X, had an enormous impact on me. It was a terrible place, hot, almost oven-like. You had men, there were only 25 or 30 of them then, but they were in these monkey cages, and they were all, I was talking to Michael X at his particular cage, and suddenly he stopped me and he said, look, he said, listen. And I stopped and we listened. There wasn't a sound. You could have heard a pin drop. And he said, this place is normally the most barbaric and cacophonous of places. Normally people are screaming, are shouting, are ranting and raving. This is the quietest that death row has ever been. And that quiet is because there is a prospect of hope. And we looked around and everyone, all the men in these monkey cages were straining against their bars to hear what I, as a most junior barrister, was saying about the prospect of appealing to the Privy Council. The Privy Council, that prospect gave them hope and had caused a miraculous quiet to descend on death row, where men had waited for years and years to know whether they'd be reprieved or not, where men were forced to listen to the trap being greased, to the gallows being erected in the next room, where one of them would hang, where every Thursday the governor of the prison would come with the warrant and walk up and down and then stop before the man who was to be executed and say, in the name of Queen Elizabeth, with the grace of God, greetings, and you're going to be hung.
At that time in Trinidad, death row housed 30 inmates in small cells. Inside was a mattress, a slop bucket, and an electric light which never switched off. Prisoners would spend a minimum of 23 hours there a day. Geoffrey Robertson would argue that justice delayed is justice denied, that spending years in these inhumane conditions was unconstitutional. Although the death penalty was abolished in the UK in 1969, sadly in the former British colonies it still continued. What's more, the Queen remained head of state, and the Privy Council in the UK was the highest court of appeal in Trinidad. And so, in a bitter irony, Michael's life was in the hands of the British legal system, even in a cell 4,000 miles away in Trinidad. In fact, the scaffold on which prisoners were hung was designed in Britain, and the rope specially imported from Birmingham for each convict. Michael was initially confident of his survival, banking on his own fame and supporters to free him. But with all avenues of appeal failing, his confidence turned to resignation. He looked to his Islamic faith for reassurance, read copiously, and even wrote poetry.
The floors you can see are never scrubbed. The stench would pervade the nostrils, blocked. The pain of waiting is in the eyes of all. The gallows door is but 6 feet away. Some true beings speak and write of death row, but living here is worse than the death blow. Often I hear, "Let me die now, put an end to my misery, finish this pain." Some do it themselves with makeshift nooses. I look at their dead bodies and see peace, a face which moments before wore torment. Of course, my language here is different. This is another world.
Michael's legal team appeared before the Privy Council on the 1st of May 1975. The argument of justice delayed is justice denied was shot down mercilessly by the law lords. They replied that the delay was only due to Michael's appeals, and if he wished to quicken his death, he should stop appealing. In fact, this spurred them into action. By Wednesday the 14th of May, within 2 weeks, a record-breaking time, they had sent their official judgment back to Trinidad. The Queen had signed Michael's death warrant. According to Geoffrey Robertson, no one had yet assessed Michael's sanity. Attempts for Michael to see a psychiatrist had been blocked by the Trinidadian government. As a last-ditch attempt, Robertson prepared an appeal on that basis. But it was too late.
There was a convention that every hanging was preceded by, first of all, the reading of the death warrant, which would be read on Thursdays, and the hanging would take place the following Tuesday, which gave enough time for the rather grisly and macabre ritual of weighing the body so that the rope didn't break or so that the hanging didn't go wrong, and that took the hangman did that for several days. But it also enabled relatives to visit, it enabled a last meal, it enabled I suppose, the prisoner to make his peace with God or whomsoever. And it also, of course, enabled any last-minute appeals.
Robertson phoned to check if Michael's death warrant had been read out on the traditional Thursday, and was pleased to find out it hadn't. That meant he had over a week to launch his new appeal. But the Trinidadian government acted in an underhand fashion and broke this long-established rule.
The behavior of the Trinidad government was truly wicked because they got the governor to sign the death warrant, and they read it late at night, at about 9 o'clock at night, for execution at 5 a.m. the next morning. So that was done, of course, so that there was no prospect of Michael's lawyers getting to a court or getting to a judge.
Michael was stunned at the news. In Trinidad, the traditions of death row go back centuries. There is a clear procedure that inmates and prison guards understand. These rituals mask the brutality of the act, while still allowing some dignity to the prisoner in his final days. But in Michael's case, many of these were disregarded. The authorities refused to let him phone his solicitor. He wasn't given the opportunity to have his last meal. He wasn't able to say goodbye to his children. He was given one last chance to meet with his wife Desiree, who had seen him only that afternoon. But he refused, saying it would be unbearable for them both. Meanwhile, the other prisoners on death row, perhaps as shocked as Michael at the sudden news, began to pray. At 6 a.m. on the 16th of May 1975, the prison guards began the official execution procedure. Michael was stripped and washed, dressed in a white gown. A white hood, like that of the Ku Klux Klan, was placed over his head. He refused to speak to priests or an imam and was walked to the gallows. He was hung at 7 a.m. Then a strange and macabre tradition took place. The execution party set up a table and enjoyed a full-cooked breakfast beside Michael's swinging body. Afterwards, they cut him down and took him to the prison hospital. Here, they would cut the wrists and the Achilles tendons to ensure the dead could never rise up. Michael protested his innocence until the day he died. By today's standards, I wonder if he would have been convicted, because there was no physical evidence tying him to the murders, simply the testimony of his supposed accomplices. This is a view shared by Gail Benson's brother, Frank Plug.
Of course, he was never convicted of murdering her. I don't think the trial was all that fair either. So by modern standards, I suppose you could say that there were lots of trials 50 years ago, and they're not as thorough as they are these days. But he seems to be the one in charge down at Christina Gardens. I'm sure nothing would have been done without his say-so, but that's only my opinion. It wouldn't stand up in court, would it?
I agree that even if Michael deserved a modicum of doubt from the jury, it seems inconceivable that not one but two murders could take place at his home without him knowing about them. However, when I discussed the murders with people who knew Michael, the general consensus was that they did not believe him capable of it, although they would often couch that statement with his noted ability to shapeshift. I asked Black Power activist Roy Saw, who'd set up RAS with Michael, did he think he was capable of murder?
No, personally no.
Pete Jenner, Michael's friend who founded the London Free School with him, conceded he was a naughty boy, but...
I was never convinced that he had anything to do with murdering, because I knew him well enough. I can't imagine him murdering people.
Barbara Shervington, who set up the Notting Hill Carnival with Michael, said,
even when it happened and we heard, and I said to my husband, I can never believe that Michael would do that, ever. But there again, there were two Michaels, weren't there? And God knows what happened to him when he went to Trinidad. You know, you just don't know, do you?
Either way, Michael's death made Jeffrey Robertson, in his words, determined to practice a law that would protect life, not take it. In 1993, Robertson would finally be successful in using the arguments he had made in Michael's appeal to convince the Privy Council that it amounted to torture to keep someone on death row for a prolonged period of time. This rule, which has since been applied to cases throughout the Caribbean, has been credited with saving many hundreds of lives. But Michael left behind many victims. Frank Plug.
Well, I felt sort of vengeful, you know. I was delighted when he was hanged, to be honest with you. Looking back now, maybe I shouldn't feel that way because I perhaps changed my mind about capital punishment and everything else. But at the time, I think I just wanted vengeance and catch the people who did this. And I don't like to think about it too much, the terrible death she had. It was really quite awful. But 50 years later, it eases a bit. I think my mother felt it hardest. I think, if you lose a child, it's worse than losing a brother or sister. We just tried to live normally, and just try to forget about it as much as one could, and live one's life.
Michael's daughter, Hasina Malik.
We had a pretty difficult time. We were spat at in the streets. Small-minded people who shout and murderers' children, or there's the murderer's wife, who spit at us. People did not take well to what was happening. I think my mother came from a fairly well-to-do family, and she brought what they did consider, I think, shame on them. And we were thrown out of the family house, and we had to go off and live somewhere else. So my mother and her 5 girls were out on the street, and all sorts of things happened. Landlords would choose to evict us at 2 a.m. So there were, a few occasions of sleeping under the awning of the shop with our belongings until we could find somewhere else to live. All the celebrity support went away. No one owes you anything. Nobody owes you anything. We just knew we were just doing what we had to do. And I imagine for my sisters, my older sisters who were teenagers, this must have been so hard for them. I think it affected them profoundly. These were girls who knew their father and knew what was about to happen to their father. We had a difficult time there, the women he left behind.
So who was Michael X? And how are we to judge him? He projected an image of a man who was trying to change things, as a leader of black people in the UK, as a visionary, undaunted by the British establishment and its institutions. But for so many people, he never met those expectations.
When you pricked it, it was a bubble that was just burst. There was nothing to it. He had no significance. He had no weight. He wasn't doing anything. Malcolm X was involved in serious business, or Stokely Carmichael was involved in serious business. This man had no impact on the state of any kind. There was no politics at all. He was not doing anything for anybody. He didn't move anybody in the heart. It was theatre, grand theatre, but no more.
Michael's been much maligned for being a political lightweight. I tend to agree with this. He was never a Malcolm X nor a Stokely Carmichael, although he clung to their coattails. Through this lens, he can be judged as a failure. The reason for this is that at every opportunity, he never put in the work required to effect political change. He organized no protests. RAS was a shell of an organization lacking a true purpose, which Michael used instead as a kind of security service that gave the illusion of power. The model of the Black House had the potential to be scaled up and replicated around the UK, offering hope to a new black generation born in the UK. But instead, it was corrupted by his greed. Michael's friend, the writer Barry Miles.
I think he was a very conflicted man, but his heart was in the right place. He saw a tremendous amount of injustice and he tried to fix it in his own way. But he had a pretty heavy past which kept intruding, sometimes taking over his good motives.
Perhaps we need to change the lens with which we look at Michael. He never claimed to be a saint. In fact, he revelled in coming from the gutter. As he himself said, he had no desire to be the acceptable face of Black Britain, invited to the Queen's garden parties. He was no selfless nurse like Mary Seacole. He didn't lobby against segregation like the activist Paul Stevenson. But he did have some effect. Anti-apartheid campaigner Ben Bousquet.
Nobody sort of says, well, Michael was a saint, But by the same token, I dare anybody to say that he was a devil. I know a lot of people whom he helped. And I know a lot of kids who listened to him when he used to make his speeches, who would say the things the kids wanted to hear. Because he'd been through it. The fact that he'd been an enforcer, the fact that he'd been in jail, doesn't make any difference. In fact, his namesake, Malcolm X, had been in jail, was also an enforcer. That doesn't diminish from the fact that once he pushed that aside, that he was trying to do something different, and was trying to do something well, and was trying to do something good, and is giving some young kids something to look at, something to emulate. Because he didn't tell them to go to jail. He never told them to become enforcers. In fact, when he spoke to them, he told them to go away from it. Don't do what I did. There are other ways to do things.
Michael was perhaps relatable because he was flawed. He definitely had charisma. He made friends easily, gathering loyal followers and admirers, many of the cultural icons of the day, Lenin, Muhammad Ali, William Burroughs. But he wasn't polished. He was impatient. He blundered, he bragged. He made mistake after mistake and paid for it with constant surveillance, prison sentences, and finally his life. For me, Michael was at his best when being a voice of defiance for black people in Britain, a voice that was missing at the time. Even if it was just a show, an image, he spoke of black being beautiful at a time where it was considered anything but, of the need to be financially independent, to educate black children on the impact of slavery and the rich and proud history of black people. He espoused the idea that equality and happiness for black people should happen today, not in some afterlife. But Michael was complicated. That's what drew me to him in the first place. Hate him or love him, he was a product of the British Empire. He travelled to begin a new life in the mother country, but on arrival faced prejudice and felt that keenly, as a kind of rejected love. His experience mirrors that of so many who came to Britain's shores from the colonies. And the legacy of empire still lingers on. From colorism to discrimination to the way the Home Office and the police deal with minorities, there's often a failure to recognise that there's a direct link from that past to the present day. Michael participated in some of the seminal moments of black British history, the Notting Hill riots, the Black Power movement, the creation of Carnival, British history. But where is he in the history books? Understandably, due to his crimes in Trinidad, he's omitted. No one wants to claim him. But perhaps we should look at controversial characters that don't fit neat descriptions or serve as perfect examples. Because life isn't like that. People are complex, and we can perhaps learn more from unseemly aspects of our history. Michael presciently said that one day people like the imperialist Cecil Rhodes won't be considered as great heroes and philanthropists, but as plunderers and murderers. Today, cancel culture wants Cecil's statue boarded up. Michael X has never even had a plinth, nor does he deserve one. But we should be able to have a nuanced discussion about figures like him and Cecil Rhodes, to speak about things that make us feel uncomfortable, the dark parts of our history, because without processing those, we can't understand our present or how to move forward as a society. My name is Hamza Salmi, and this was Who Was Michael X? Who Was Michael X was presented, written and produced by Hamza Salmi. Featuring Peter DeJersey as Michael X, assistant producer Wayland Mackenzie, researcher Palumi Odubanjo, technical producer Tim Heffer, theme music by Kyron Akau, production mentors Claire Walker and Joe Kent, executive producers Kalik Mir and Leanne Ali, commissioned for BBC Sounds Audio Lab by Kalik Mir.